Hi, everybody. Welcome to Fishtrap's NEA Big Read, where this year we are celebrating the book In the Heart of the Sea, The Tragedy of the Whale Ship Essex by Nathaniel Philbrick. And what we've been doing is partnering the last several weeks, the last several episodes with our new friends, the Columbia River Maritime Museum in Astoria, Oregon. Doing these ed talks. And so I don't want to spend too much time, except I do want to thank our Big Read sponsors, Community Bank, Arts Center East, the Oregon Arts Commission, and the Book Loft. Thanks to all those folks, and thanks to all the schools and teachers and communities and libraries for cracking open this book and participating with us. I hope you really enjoyed it. All right, let's get to our new friends. Julia Triezenberg, who is at the Columbia River Maritime Museum. What is the subject for today?
All right, everybody. Today we are talking all about sailor slang. And the really fun thing about slang expressions is that there's all kinds of different explanations for why we say what we say. In the maritime world in particular, there's kind of this running joke that we have canoe, which stands for the Committee to Assign a Nautical Origin to Everything. And so today we're going to be talking about a few of those nautical origins. I've prepared kind of a greatest hits list for you of all of these different slang expressions with explanations for why we say what we say. And so our first expression is showing your true colors, which we mean, of course, to say you're revealing yourself for who you really are, you're showing your true character. And they say that this expression actually comes from the opposite phrase, which was showing your false colors, originally during the age of sail. It was a very common strategy for ships to sail through unfriendly territory, through enemy waters, with their false colors or flags from other countries, right? Flags that weren't their own. And so it was kind of commonly regarded, right, because the maritime world valued pride and honor above so many other things, that before you attacked your enemies, you had to lower your false colors and show your true colors, right? Reveal your real flag from the country that you're coming from so that your enemy knows exactly who's attacking them. You don't want to start trouble with other countries if they're not really involved. So showing your true colors, revealing where you're really from and who you really are. This next expression, I would say we probably don't use too much in our daily lives, but you hear it a lot in dramatic movies, which is when people say things like, I'll be with you until the bitter end. And some people say that the bitter end originally comes from these bits, these posts that you would attach ropes or lines to, and you can find those on ships, you can find them on docks. They're all over the place. The inmost part of these ropes, the part that's closest to the bit, is known as the bitter end. So say you're using this line, you've reached the end of your rope, there's nothing left to use, that would be considered reaching the bitter end, right? That rope that's attached to your bit. And so you can see as well, right, the bitter end and being at the end of your rope may actually have similar origins too. For this next expression, you can probably guess where this one is going. The phrase is scraping the bottom of the barrel or hitting rock bottom, right? You've nothing left to use. And this, of course, comes from the idea that during the 1700s and 1800s, a lot of rations, a lot of food on board these ships was stored in wooden barrels. So if you're weeks or months into your voyage and you're scraping salted meat from the bottom of the barrel, that really was considered hitting rock bottom. So scraping the bottom of the barrel. Now we all love loopholes, right? We all love ways around what we can and can't do. The original loophole referred to the structure of the ship itself, right? These loopholes are basically gaps in between the bulkheads or like the vertical slats in all of these ships. And so the interesting thing, or the unique thing about these loopholes, is that sailors could attack their enemies without them realizing it by putting little weapons, little guns in between these gaps in the ship without them knowing, right? They're focusing on the cannons that are on board. They're not paying attention to the loopholes. Now, this originally refers to the structure of the ship, but nowadays we use it a lot in a legal context, right? With law, with court cases. And so the first person supposedly who popularized using loophole in court cases was actually President Thomas Jefferson during the early 1800s. Now, you're looking here at a photo of the city of Yokohama in Japan, and it has a very bustling and vibrant waterfront district. We're focusing on the waterfront today, going back 80 or so years ago, all the way back to World War II. Because sailors, American sailors on shore leave, right? They're allowed to leave their ships, they're coming onto land, would spend a lot of time in one particular part of Yokohama called HhunkyDory. And HhunkyDory had all of these different things you could do. It was kind of like a sailor's paradise. It was anything that you can imagine that was there while these sailors were on shore leave. And so they came to associate HhunkyDory as being really, really great. It was kind of this phrase that they used to describe something amazing. But the problem with this was these were American sailors who didn't really know how to pronounce Japanese names. And so when they said something was really, really great, they didn't say HhunkyDory, they said hunky-dory, right? So if you've ever used that phrase saying, oh, everything's great, everything's fine, everything is hunky-dory, you're actually referencing this story from 80 or so years ago of these American sailors on shore leave during World War II. Now, one of the most common questions that I get from our visitors at the museum is, what's the deal with Davy Jones, right? Davy Jones' locker, this symbol of a watery grave, of a shipwreck at sea. And there's actually a few different explanations that I've heard for this one in particular. Some people say that Davy Jones is like this alternate character that originally came from the West Indies, from the Caribbean. And these sailors were really afraid of a character called Duffy Jonah, who was like this devilish figure that could take down their ships while they were at sea. Other people will say that this doesn't originate from the West Indies. It actually comes from Wales and is kind of like this evil alternative to Saint David. Other people will tell you that there is some sort of religious aspect to this and how far back the story of Davy Jones goes, but they'll say that it's actually a reference to Jonah and the whale, right? Once again, this kind of tragedy or misfortune at sea, your fate being decided by the forces of nature, and that kind of turned into the story that we know today as being Davy Jones and Davy Jones' locker. You're looking now at a photo of Hotchpot, which was this dish that was served really often on English and French ships during the 1700s in particular, I believe. And I tend to describe this as being kind of like a trash can casserole. There's all kinds of different stuff that's been thrown into this to make it a meal for these sailors. It's a little bit of this and a little bit of that, right? And we say that Hotchpot is actually one of a few different things that gave us the expression hodgepodge. Hodgepodge, right? Being a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's an aspect of cooking history, right? With this dish that we're talking about. And it also might be an aspect of shipwreck history, because some people will tell you that if two ships collided, when they were kind of splitting up the wreckage of what they found in the water, they would divide it evenly, no matter who originally owned it. So say if there's a chair that they find in the water and ship A originally owned that chair, ship B might still take it because the understanding was that both ships were responsible for the collision, right? So this concept of the hodgepodge being these two ships kind of dividing up a little bit of this and a little bit of that from the shipwreck itself. It's a blend of all of these different stories that are said to have given us this expression. My personal favorite story that I wanted to share with you today, I actually just learned about this a few weeks ago, and this is the story of Admiral Horatio Nelson and the Battle of Copenhagen. So Admiral Nelson lost vision in one of his eyes in battle when he was 35, and a few years later, he found himself fighting during the Battle of Copenhagen in the early 1800s. And as he's fighting, eventually his commanders give him the order to retreat, to pull back. But Admiral Nelson does not want to pull back. So what does he do? Well, he takes his telescope and he puts it up to his bad eye, or he turns his blind eye to the order that his commanders are giving him, and he pushes forward and ends up winning the battle. When he explains himself to his commanders, he says, well, if I have to live with this blind eye for the rest of my life, then I might as well be able to make some use out of it, right? So the concept of turning a blind eye, of consciously ignoring something, even though we know it to be true, originally comes from the story of Admiral Nelson and the Battle of Copenhagen. Now, these last two phrases or words that I'm going to share with you are, I suppose, not technically slang, but they have really interesting maritime backgrounds as to why we say what we say. And so for this expression, we're going over 700 years into the past to the 1300s, and we're talking about medieval Europe with the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, considered to be one of the worst epidemics in human history. And now the Black Death spread in a bunch of different ways, but one of the ways that people were concerned about was ports and all of these ships moving from port to port across Europe, because the disease was really spreading from the fleas that were on the rats that were on these ships. And so in the 1300s, the Council of Health was originally founded in Venice, Italy. And what this Council of Health did was it put in a law saying that any ships that wanted to come into Venice had to isolate themselves in the port for 40 days before any crew members were allowed inside the city. They had to stay in the water for 40 days before they could come in. And so this word that we use every day nowadays, this word quarantine, originally comes from the Italian word for 40, right? This concept of isolating yourself to protect other people from the spread of disease. Once again, a word that we've gotten from over 700 years ago. And last but not least, one of the other common questions that I get from the students that I work with here at the museum is, why do we say port for left and starboard for right on a ship? And I say, if you thought that these words are weird for left and right, then you won't believe what we used to use. Because before we had port for left and starboard for right, we actually used to say larboard and steerboard instead, spelled kind of funny there. The reason for this was most people are right-handed, right? So on those old-timey ships, all of your steering equipment would be on the right-hand side. So the right side became known as the steering side, or the steerboard side. Now, as a ship came into port, it would be loading and unloading all of this stuff that was going on board. And the loading side happened to be on the left side as they were going into port. So lar being kind of like this old-timey word for to load, the larboard side was the loading side when these ships were docking. Now, as time goes on, steerboard kind of just turns into starboard because it's easier to say. And so then we added larboard and starboard as these sailors are trying to figure out left from right. If you're at the top of a mast, you're working hard, the wind is blowing, you're out in the ocean, you can see how difficult it would be to tell the difference between larboard and starboard if someone's yelling up at you from the deck. And so to fix this problem, they kept starboard as right, but they changed left to be port, because again, remember, when you're loading and unloading things, typically speaking, it would be on the left side of the ship. And so eventually we had port for left and starboard for right to be able to tell the difference even easier. If you still can't remember all of that and it seems really confusing, what I always say is that port and left both have 4 letters. So that way, hopefully you can't forget the difference between left and right. And with that, that is my greatest hits list of sailor slang today. Hopefully you learned a few new expressions that you use out and about every day. Maybe you have different explanations for why we say these specific phrases, and I would love to hear your feedback on that as well. Once again, thank you all so much for being here with us for the NEA Big Read. This is our last presentation between Fishtrap and the Columbia River Maritime Museum, but I hope we'll see you all again sometime if you're able to visit us up here in Astoria. Thank you all so much, and with that, I'll turn it back on over to you, Mike.
Julia Triezenberg. Wow, I wish you could tell me stories like this every day. I'm going to miss this over my lunch break. This has been really fun. And all of you, I hope you enjoyed it too. You can go back to fishtrap.org to the Big Read page and revisit, replay, share any of these videos that have been going on. And next week on March 17, we are having the Big Read finale with the author of the book, Nathaniel Philbrick, all the way from the island of Nantucket. We're doing that in a very kind of special partnership with Middletown Public Library in New Jersey. Isn't that something? They are also starting their Big Read, and you can access all the events and resources that they have too. So go to fishtrap.org and take a look at what's happening. And do get in touch with Julia and the people at the Columbia River Maritime Museum. This has been a great time. I've enjoyed it every time I visited there. So with that, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week for the Big Read finale.